Today we're going to learn about questioning the author. Questioning the author is a reading strategy that can help us understand what we're reading even when the author is not making a whole lot of sense. Our goal today is going to learn how to ask and answer questions as we're reading. And to do that, we're going to learn what to do when we don't understand what we read, and we're going to learn how to make sure we always understand what we're reading. Authors, just like us, aren't perfect, which means their words aren't always perfect. Have you ever told a story to a friend and they just didn't get what you were saying? Authors have the same problem sometimes. But if we just ask questions, we can figure out what they're saying. Even though the author's not there, we can do this with the author as well. Questioning the author is a strategy that allows us to figure out what the author is saying when they weren't being very clear. There are a few different steps to this strategy. First, stop when there's something confusing. Don't just keep reading if you don't get it. That doesn't help anybody. Second, ask a question. Just like you would with a friend if they were being confusing, ask the author what's going on. They might not be there to answer it, but asking the question is still helpful. Then keep reading to figure out the answer. Sometimes the author tells us the answer, but it's not until later in the story. We need to keep reading to figure it out. Then go back to that question and write the answer in a way that makes sense to you. If you're wondering what the author meant by something, rewrite it. Tell the author what you figured out that they meant. Then reread the text, except this time, don't read those confusing words that the author wrote. Read your not confusing words that you rewrote. Let's give it a try. Read along with me. A wolf found great difficulty in getting at the sheep, owing to the vigilance of the shepherd and his dogs. But one day it found the skin of a sheep that had been flayed and thrown aside. So it put it on over its own pelt and strolled down among the sheep. The lamb that belonged to the sheep, whose skin the wolf was wearing, began to follow the wolf in the sheep's clothing. So, leading the lamb a little apart, he soon made a meal of her, and for some time he succeeded in deceiving the sheep and enjoying hearty meals. Let's remember our strategy. We're going to stop when there's something confusing, ask a question, keep reading to figure out the answer, write it in a way that makes sense to us, and reread the text. So let's start with that strategy at the beginning. A wolf found great difficulty in getting at the sheep owing to the vigilance of the shepherd and his dogs. There's stuff that I didn't understand. I'm just going to underline it. You can see there were two parts that were confusing to me. First, found great difficulty. I don't get what that means. And second, owing to the vigilance. Again, I just don't get it. So I underlined these because that'll help me keep track of what it was that was confusing. Now I need to ask a question. Found great difficulty. I guess I could just ask the author what that means. What does it mean to find great difficulty? Perfect. Now I want to ask the author about the other thing in that sentence that was confusing to me, owing to the vigilance. What does owing to the vigilance mean? I need to know before I can understand this passage. Let's keep reading to see if we can figure out the answer. But one day it found the skin of a sheep that had been flayed and thrown aside, so it put it on over its own pelt and strolled down among the sheep. There are two things in this sentence that are confusing to me: flayed and pelt. I need to ask the author what these mean. What does flayed mean? And what does pelt mean? When I answer these, I'll be able to understand this sentence a lot better. Let's keep going. The lamb that belonged to the sheep, whose skin the wolf was wearing, began to follow the wolf in the sheep's clothing. So, leading the lamb a little apart, he soon made a meal of her, and for some time he succeeded in deceiving the sheep and enjoying hearty meals. I can go ahead and underline the things that were confusing to me here. First, the wolf in the sheep's clothing. I don't really get that. What kind of clothes does sheep wear after all? That doesn't make sense. I thought they didn't wear clothes. And then made a meal of her. How does a wolf make a meal of the lamb? I'm going to need to answer that question too. Now that I have all of my questions written down, I'm ready to start answering them. Let's start again at the beginning. A wolf found great difficulty in getting at the sheep. Well, I definitely know what it means to find something, and I know what great difficulty means. That means something is really hard. So maybe the wolf found something, and that thing was really hard. So let me think how I could say this differently. Maybe the wolf had trouble getting at the sheep. That's a way that makes more sense to me. So I'm going to write that down. The wolf had trouble in getting at the sheep. Now I'm ready to move on to the next question. What does owing to the vigilance mean? Why would a wolf have trouble getting at the sheep? Probably because the shepherd and his dogs were working really hard. It's because of their hard work. So how could I change this underlined part? A wolf had trouble in getting at the sheep because of the hard work of the shepherd and his dogs. This sentence makes a lot more sense now. Remember, what you come up with doesn't have to be perfect. You are not a human dictionary, but that's okay. What's important here is that what you substitute makes sense, and in both of these cases, it makes more sense now. Let's keep going. But one day it found the skin of a sheep that had been flayed and thrown aside. Now, I don't have the slightest idea what flayed means, but I know that the only way you can get a skin from a sheep is if you cut it off the sheep. So maybe we could say cut off. But one day it found the skin of a sheep that had been cut off and thrown aside. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to make sense. So it put it on over its own pelt and strolled down among the sheep. Well, if he's putting on the sheep's skin, kind of like clothes, he would have to put it on over his own skin maybe. So another word for pelt could be skin. I'm going to write that in. The lamb that belonged to the sheep, whose skin the wolf was wearing, began to follow the wolf in the sheep's clothing. Oh, I get this phrase now. The sheep's clothing is the sheep's skin, and the wolf is wearing it. So that's kind of like the wolf is wearing the sheep's clothing. But it might make a little bit more sense if I say the wolf in the sheep's skin. That makes a little bit more sense to me. So, leading the lamb a little apart, he soon made a meal of her, and for some time he succeeded in deceiving the sheep and enjoying hearty meals. I don't know what it means to make a meal of her, but I get the feeling that the wolf definitely ate the sheep, so I'm just going to write that instead. Okay, now that we've answered all of our questions and we've written it in a way that makes sense to us, we're ready to reread the text. This time, though, we're not going to read the author's confusing words. We're going to read our words that make a lot more sense to us. Let's start at the beginning. A wolf had trouble in getting at the sheep because of the hard work of the shepherd and his dogs. But one day it found the skin of a sheep that had been cut off and thrown aside. So it put it on over its own skin and strolled down among the sheep. The lamb belonged to the sheep, whose skin the wolf was wearing, began to follow the wolf in the sheep's skin. So, leading the lamb a little apart, he soon ate the sheep, and for some time he succeeded in deceiving the sheep and enjoying hearty meals. Do you see how this strategy really helps us understand the text a lot better? I know for me it makes a lot more sense now than it did when we read it the first time. I know that you'll be able to do this on your own. Just remember to question the author as you read. Good luck!